Callahan, abort. That is a direct order. She didn't answer. 2 years they'd called her a cook. 2 years of burned bacon jokes and men half her rank laughing at breakfast while she diced onions with hands that used to fly at 400 knots. Now 40 miles east, 3 vehicles were pinned against a rock embankment, bleeding out under crossfire, and every qualified pilot on this base was grounded, gone, or unavailable. Everyone except the woman they'd erased. Callahan, do you copy? This is your last warning. She pushed the throttle forward. The engines roared. The A-10 lifted off a runway she wasn't cleared to touch, carrying a pilot the Air Force had spent 2 years insisting didn't matter anymore. What none of them knew, not the general shouting into the radio, not the men on that highway, was that the same night her aircraft failed 2 years ago, somebody had cut those hydraulic lines on purpose. And they were still on this base. 4:15 in the morning, and Reese Callahan was already awake. She always was. 2 years of grounding hadn't managed to touch that one habit, the way her body still snapped alert before the alarm, still expected a pre-flight briefing that never came, still ran through checklists in the dark for an aircraft she wasn't allowed near. She sat on the edge of her bunk in the gray half-light, lacing her boots with the same double knot her father had taught her before she was tall enough to reach the laces without kneeling. Precise. Unhurried. A small private ritual nobody on this base knew about, because nobody on this base had ever bothered to ask what she did with the hours before her shift. On the shelf above her footlocker sat a single photograph curling slightly at one corner. Her father in his flight suit, squinting into Nevada sun, one arm slung around a canopy rail like it was an old friend. She touched the corner of the frame the way she did every morning, a habit as automatic as breathing, and didn't let herself linger on it longer than a second and a half. Grief she'd learned was survivable in small doses. It was the long look that broke you. Beneath the photograph, tucked behind a stack of folded t-shirts where nobody would think to look, sat a logbook. Her logbook. 400 hours of flight time, recorded in her own handwriting, dates and aircraft numbers and mission notes. The entire record of who she used to be before a phrase on somebody else's report had decided who she was allowed to be instead. She hadn't opened it in months. She didn't open it now. Just let her fingers rest against the worn cover for a moment, the way you'd rest a hand against a door you weren't ready to walk through yet. Outside, the sky over Ashcombe was still more black than blue, stars fading reluctantly as the base slowly came awake around her. Engines coughing to life, somewhere on the flight line, boots on gravel, the distant clang of a hangar door. Sounds that had once meant something to her. Sounds she now heard only from the outside, standing at the edge of a life she used to belong to. She closed the footlocker, squared her shoulders, and walked to the mess hall, the way she walked everywhere now, steady, unremarkable. A woman who had trained herself through sheer repetition to look like exactly nothing worth noticing. It was a lie she'd gotten very good at telling. The knife hit the cutting board like a metronome. Steady, precise. Too precise for someone dicing onions. Reese Callahan didn't look up when the mess hall doors banged open. She didn't have to. She knew the walk. Heavy boots, wide shoulders. A man who took up space because he'd never once been told not to. Well, look who's queen of the potatoes today. Staff Sergeant Boyd Trammell. 6'2" of nothing but attitude and a haircut that cost more than his personality deserved. He dropped his tray on the counter hard enough to rattle the serving spoons. Morning, Trammell. Her voice flat, unbothered. A voice built over 2 years of practice at sounding unbothered. Heard you burned the bacon again. Heard you failed your PT test again, twice. Somewhere behind her, a cook named Dell snorted into a pot of grits. Trammell's jaw tightened. Careful, Callahan. Kitchen's a privilege. He leaned in over the counter close enough that she could smell yesterday's beer on him. Wouldn't want them to take that away, too. She didn't answer, just kept dicing. The knife never slowed, because that was the trick, wasn't it? Keep the hands busy, keep the face empty. Let them think the woman behind the counter was exactly what she looked like, a cook. Nothing more. Except her hands didn't belong to a cook, not really. They belonged to someone who used to make split-second adjustments at 400 knots. Someone who used to walk a pre-flight check-in under 6 minutes with her eyes half shut from exhaustion. Someone who used to matter. 2 years. 2 years since anyone on this base had called her captain and meant it. Trammell grabbed his tray and sauntered off toward the tables, already laughing with his buddies before he'd even sat down. Something about her. Always something about her. Dell sidled up beside her, wiping his hands on his apron. "You good?" "I'm great." She wasn't looking at him. She was looking past him, past the mess hall window, past the chain-link fence, at the flight line, where 2 A-10 Thunderbolts sat gleaming under the Nevada sun like sleeping animals. Waiting. Her chest did the thing it always did. That tightening, that ache just under the ribs that had no name because naming it made it real. She looked away first. She always looked away first. Dell had been at Ashcombe longer than most, long enough to remember the version of her that used to walk through this same mess hall in a flight suit instead of an apron. Laughing too loud at somebody's joke, exhausted in the particular way that only came from doing something you loved too hard. Across the room, Major Weston Sutton sat alone at a corner table, wrist-braced in a black support, working through a plate of eggs, one-handed, with the mild irritation of a man who'd rather be anywhere else. I didn't look up when she walked past with a fresh tray of biscuits. Didn't look up most mornings. To him, she was furniture, a fixture of the mess hall, no more interesting than the coffee urn or the napkin dispenser. And she'd long since stopped expecting anything different from him. "You ever gonna tell me what really happened?" he asked low so Trammell's table wouldn't hear. 2 years I've been serving grits next to you. Never once heard the real story. Nothing to tell. Equipment failed. I got blamed. End of story. Don't sound like the end of anything to me. She didn't answer that. Some doors, once you opened them, didn't close back up the same. So she left it shut, the way she'd left it shut, for 731 mornings running, and went back to the onions and let the knife do the talking instead of her mouth. Because talking about it meant thinking about it. And thinking about it meant standing in that hospital room again, concussed ears, still ringing from an engine that had screamed wrong in a way engines weren't supposed to scream. Staring up at General Ashwell's face while he told her the Incident Review Board had made its determination. Pilot error. 2 words. That was all it took to erase 3 years of flawless service record. 2 words, and suddenly nobody remembered the commendations, the perfect scores, the missions flown clean. All they remembered was the smoke on the runway and the woman who'd walked away from a wrecked aircraft. While somewhere quietly, somebody else's mistake got filed under her name instead of theirs. She'd read that report exactly once. Standing in a hallway outside the flight surgeon's office, hands shaking too hard to hold the pages steady. Equipment malfunction attributed to pilot error. 6 words that had taken maybe 4 seconds to write and had cost her in the 2 years since more than she'd ever managed to fully count. She hadn't fought it, not hard enough. She'd been 24 years old and half convinced by grief and morphine that maybe they were right. Maybe she had missed something. Maybe the failure was hers after all. It had taken her 2 years of scrubbing pots to stop believing that lie. And even now, some mornings, it still crept back in quiet as steam off a stove, whispering that she deserved every bit of this. Ashcombe Air Force Base didn't look like much from a distance. A scatter of low buildings baking in heat that shimmered off the tarmac in visible waves. A perimeter fence stretching into scrubland that went nowhere forever in every direction. The kind of place people got assigned to and then spent their whole careers trying to get assigned out of. It had a runway long enough for anything the Air Force wanted to land on it, a control tower that looked older than most of the pilots who reported to it, and a water tower painted with a squadron insignia so faded nobody remembered what unit it used to represent. 90 miles from the nearest town worth naming. Close enough to nothing that the silence at night had its own particular weight, the kind that pressed against your ears until you forgot what traffic sounded like. Reese used to love it here. Used to. That was before the accident report. Before the phrase, malfunction attributed to pilot error, got typed into a file with her name on it and locked away somewhere she'd never be allowed to touch. Before the flight surgeon signed the form that grounded her. Before General Ashwell looked her dead in the eye across his desk and said the word cook like it was a kindness he was doing her. She still remembered the exact temperature of that room. cold enough that she could see her own breath, or thought she could. Grief did strange things to memory. 15 years earlier, her father had sat her down in the garage of their house in Elko and told her something she'd never forgotten. Flying isn't about being fearless, Reese. It's about being the calmest person in a room that's on fire. He'd said it while cleaning a rifle scope that had nothing to do with flying at all. The way he explained most things, sideways through whatever object happened to be in his hands. Colonel Reese Callahan, A-10 pilot, 22 years of service, a ribbon rack that took up his entire left chest, and a laugh that filled up whatever room he walked into. Her hero before she knew what the word meant, and long after she understood exactly what it cost. She remembered the garage smelling like gun oil and orange soda, remembered sitting cross-legged on a stool too tall for her, remembered asking him if he was ever scared up there. He'd laughed, not unkindly, and set the scope down, and looked at her the way he looked at things he wanted her to actually keep. Everybody's scared, Reese. Fear's not the problem. Fear's just information. The problem is letting it drive. She was 11 when he said that. She hadn't understood it then. She understood it now, standing in a kitchen that smelled like bacon grease instead of gun oil. Letting fear sit quiet in the passenger seat of her whole life, instead of driving it into a cockpit where it belonged. Dead at 48. Training accident, they said. Mechanical failure during a routine exercise, they said. Case closed, they said, and closed it fast. Faster than made sense if you asked 12-year-old Reese standing at a funeral in a black dress 2 sizes too big, staring at a flag folded into a triangle that somehow held the entire weight of her father inside it. She remembered the chaplain's voice going soft and distant, the way adults' voices did when they were trying not to cry in front of a child. She remembered her mother's hand, ice cold, gripping hers too tight. She remembered thinking even then, even at 12, that something about the story didn't sit right. The base had released a 2-paragraph statement. 2 paragraphs for a man who'd flown 300 combat sorties without so much as a scratch. 2 paragraphs, and then silence, and then everyone moved on, like grief had a shelf life the Air Force had decided in advance. Nobody asked 12-year-old Reese anything. Nobody asked her what she remembered about the last phone call 3 days before when her father's voice had sounded strange, tight, distracted. When he'd said something about people at the base she didn't like the sound of, and then laughed it off before she could ask what he meant. She joined the Air Force the day she turned 18. Flight school 4 years after that, top of a class that hadn't expected a 5'4" woman with her father's exact eyes to outfly half the men twice her size. Because if there was one thing Reese Callahan's daughter refused to become, it was someone who let a room burn without doing something about it. And now she was dicing onions in a base kitchen while men half her rank made jokes about her at breakfast. Funny how a life could fold in on itself like that. Like a flag. Like a triangle. Something small enough to fit in your hands and heavy enough to break them. Lieutenant Colonel Preston Holt found her later that morning out by the equipment shed, sitting on a stack of pallets with a cup of coffee gone cold in her hands. Holt was the only officer on this base who still called her captain and made it sound like a fact instead of a joke. 51 years old, silver at the temples. A voice that carried the particular gravity of a man who'd spent 3 decades teaching younger pilots how not to die. He'd flown with her father once, years before Reese was born, to know it firsthand, a story he told sparingly, like something precious he didn't want to wear out. Trammell giving you trouble again. Trammell's always giving me trouble. You want me to have a word? I want you to let me handle my own battles, sir. Same as always. Holt smiled the kind of smile that had earned its lines the hard way. He lowered himself onto the pallet beside her, joints cracking in protest, and looked out at the flight line, same as she'd been looking at it. Your father used to sit exactly like that, he said. Right before a mission, quiet, watching the birds like they were about to say something back to him. You said that last time, too. Because it's true every time I say it. He took a slow breath. I keep telling Ashwell he's wasting the best set of hands on this base peeling potatoes. Man doesn't listen to me any better than he listens to you. Some fights aren't yours to fight, sir. Your father would have said the exact same thing. Holt looked over at her, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. And he would have been wrong about it too. Sometimes the fights that aren't yours are exactly the ones you're supposed to pick up anyway. You sound like you're talking about something specific, sir. I'm an old man who talks in circles. Comes with the rank. He said it lightly, but something in the set of his shoulders didn't quite match the lightness, a tension she filed away without fully understanding why. Don't mind me. She didn't have an answer for that. She just sat there, watching the heat shimmer rise off the tarmac, letting herself believe for one small moment that at least one person on this base still saw her the way her father used to. She had no idea yet how much that would come to matter, or how badly it would come to hurt. The call came in at 0640, and Reese heard it the way she heard everything now, secondhand, through a doorway from people who didn't know she was listening. Convoys pinned down. That was Airman Petrov, radio operator, his voice pitched too high, the way voices got when something was actually finally wrong, instead of just another drill. Highway 9 corridor. Contractors and 2 DoD liaisons. They're taking fire from elevated positions, at least 2, maybe 3. Reese's hands stopped moving. Highway 9. She knew Highway 9. Everyone who'd trained at Ashcom knew Highway 9, the long exposed stretch of road cutting through the Cache Valley corridor where the terrain turned the whole route into a shooting gallery if you didn't have eyes in the sky. Who's up? That wasn't a question. That was Major Grady Voss, ops officer, and Reese could hear the calculation already running behind his voice, the arithmetic of who's available, who's rated, who's not going to get somebody killed. Sutton's grounded, sir. Bad wrist from the PT mishap last week. Reyes is TDY at Nellis until Thursday. A pause. A long one. That's it. That's our whole roster. Yes, sir. Reese's pulse did something strange. Something she hadn't felt in 2 years. A kind of static climbing up through her sternum into her throat. Because she knew exactly how many qualified A-10 pilots were on this base. She'd counted them every single day since she'd been grounded, the way you count your own ribs after an injury, just to make sure everything's still there. 3. There were supposed to be 3. Weston Sutton, Marcus Reyes, and her. Except nobody in that operations room was going to say her name. Nobody in that room even remembered she used to be a name worth saying. She set down the knife, quietly, deliberately, and walked toward the doorway, like something in her had already decided 3 steps ahead of the rest of her that this morning was going to be different. Trammell was still at his table, mouth full, laughing at something one of his buddies had said when she walked past without her apron. He caught it out of the corner of his eye and turned, still chewing. "Where you off to? Callahan Kitchen's not done cleaning itself." She didn't stop. Didn't even slow down. "Callahan," louder now, half a laugh still stuck in it. "Hey, I'm talking to you." She was already through the door, 40 miles east on a strip of cracked asphalt. Cutting between 2 ridgelines, the convoy was dying by inches. 3 vehicles. 2 civilian contractors and a pair of DoD liaisons pinned against a rock embankment that offered exactly nothing in the way of cover. Gunfire cracked down from the high ground on both sides, sharp and relentless, the kind of crossfire that turned a road into a coffin with wheels still attached. "Anybody got eyes on air support?" That was Foster, one of the liaisons, flat on his stomach behind a blown tire radio pressed so hard against his ear it left a mark. "Anybody. Come on." Static. Just static. Beside him a contractor named Reyes Marsh, no relation to the pilot. An irony nobody had time to appreciate, pressed a hand hard against a wound in his own leg and tried to keep his voice from shaking. "They coming or not? Working on it. Working on it's not an answer." "It's the only one I've got." Somewhere above them on the ridge, a shape moved between rocks, and another round, cracked past close enough that Foster felt the air split beside his ear. He ducked lower, said a prayer he hadn't said since he was a kid, fast and wordless, more instinct than faith. Because whoever was coming, if anyone was coming, needed to come soon. Outside Ashwell's office, a young clerk named Figueroa sat frozen at her desk, phone in hand, listening to the raised voices through a door that hadn't quite latched. She'd worked administration at Ashcombe for 8 months and had never once heard the general's voice climb that high. Not for a maintenance dispute, not for a failed inspection, not for anything short of an actual emergency. Whatever was happening in that office, it wasn't routine. She set the phone down without finishing her call and simply listened the way everyone in the building had quietly started to do. Absolutely not. General Ashwell didn't even look up from his desk. Didn't need to. He already knew what she was going to say before she said it, and the answer had been sitting in his mouth, loaded, waiting. Sir, with respect. With respect, Captain Callahan, you are not cleared to fly. You have not been cleared to fly for 2 years. That is not a policy I'm interested in revisiting in the middle of a crisis. There is no one else. There is protocol. Protocol doesn't have wings, sir. Those men on Highway 9 need. I know what they need. His voice cracked like a whip, and for a second something moved behind his eyes, something almost human, almost tired. I know exactly what they need, Captain. What I don't have is a pilot cleared to give it to them. Silence, the kind that had teeth. Ashwell finally looked up. 60 years old, gray at the edges, a man who'd built his whole career on doing things by the book because the book had never once failed him. Except books didn't fly airplanes. People did. Sir, I logged 400 hours in that aircraft. 0 incidents. 0. Until the one they pinned on me. She kept her voice level even though something underneath it was starting to shake loose. You know my record. You signed half those commendations yourself. That was before. Before what, sir? Before an engineering report that never got properly reviewed. Before a board that met for 40 minutes and decided my career wasn't worth investigating any further. That board followed procedure. That board followed convenience. The words came out sharper than she meant them to, and she watched them land, watched something flicker across the general's face that might have been anger or might have been the particular discomfort of a man being told a truth he already suspected. He stood slow and walked to the window, looking out at the same flight line she'd been staring at all morning. You think I don't remember what you were, Captain? You think I signed off on grounding you because I enjoyed it? His voice had gone quieter now, and somehow that was worse than the shouting. I had a report on my desk that said equipment failure caused by pilot error. I had a flight surgeon telling me you weren't fit to return to the cockpit. I had a board that closed the file. What was I supposed to do, override every single one of them on a hunch? You were supposed to ask why the investigation only lasted 40 minutes. That landed. She saw it land, saw his shoulders tighten under his uniform. You had a pilot. Her voice quieter now. Not pleading. She never pleaded. Just stating a fact the way her father used to state facts, flat and immovable. 2 years ago, you had a pilot. You grounded her over an incident that was never properly investigated. Ashwell's jaw tensed. That incident nearly cost you your life. That incident was sabotage. The word left her mouth before she'd fully decided to say it, and it hit the room like a dropped glass. For a moment, neither of them moved. That's a serious accusation, he said finally. Careful now, too careful. It's a serious silence, sir, every time I've brought it up. He looked at her for a long moment, and in that moment, she saw something flicker across his face that she couldn't name. Guilt, maybe, or fear. Or just the particular exhaustion of a man who'd spent 2 years hoping a problem would stay buried. Dismissed, Captain. She didn't move. Dismissed. She turned, walked to the door, stopped with her hand on the frame. Those men are going to die on that highway, she said, not turning around. And somewhere in a file cabinet in this building, there's a report that's going to explain exactly why nobody was ready to save them. I hope you sleep fine with that math, sir. She left before he could answer, which was for the best, because she wasn't sure what she would have done if he'd tried. On Highway 9, Foster had stopped counting the minutes. Time didn't mean much anymore. Pinned behind a tire that was taking more damage than cover, listening to Reyes Marsh's breathing go shallow and wrong beside him. Talk to me, Foster said, because silence out here felt like giving up, and giving up wasn't a thing he planned on doing today. Tell me something. Anything. Got a daughter. Reyes Marsh's voice came out thin, stretched over gritted teeth. Turned 6 next month. Promised her a bike. You'll give her the bike. Say it like you mean it. I mean it. Foster didn't know if he meant it. He said it anyway because some lies were worth telling, and this was one of them. Another round cracked overhead, closer this time, close enough that dust kicked up off the embankment and rained down over both of them. Somewhere behind them, one of the contractors was shouting into a radio that still wasn't answering the same word over and over. Anybody. 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 Nobody answered. Not yet. Petrov found her 40 minutes later behind the maintenance hangar, sitting on an overturned crate with her elbows on her knees and her eyes fixed on nothing. "Ma'am?" He was young. 22, maybe? The kind of young that still saluted things that didn't need saluting. "I heard what happened. In the general's office. Word travels fast around here. This whole base is basically a tin can with legs, ma'am. Everybody hears everything." She almost smiled. Almost. "You didn't come out here just to tell me that." Petrov shifted his weight, glanced back over his shoulder at the hangar door like he was checking whether the desert had grown ears sometime in the last hour. "No, ma'am, I didn't." "Then say it." "I've been in comms and records 2 years, since right around when your accident happened, actually." He said it carefully, like the word accident tasted wrong in his mouth now that he was standing in front of her. "Bunch of stuff came across my desk over that time. Most of it's boring. Fuel logs, weather reports. But maintenance archiving, that's part of my job too. Digitizing the old paper files before they get shredded. And last month, doing routine archive work, I pulled something. Old maintenance logs, from your bird, from 2 years ago." Something in Reese's chest went very still. And there's a gap, ma'am. A 12-hour gap the night before your flight, where the hydraulic inspection log shows a signature that doesn't match the tech assigned to your aircraft that shift. She stood up so fast the crate nearly tipped. "Show me." The file was small. Smaller than it had any right to be given how much of her life it had quietly ended. Petrov had it saved on a drive he kept separate from the base network, tucked into a folder labeled "Something Boring" on purpose. He pulled it up on a laptop balanced on an ammunition crate, and Reese leaned over his shoulder like a woman leaning over the edge of something high up. There it was. Her aircraft's tail number. The date. The hydraulic control line inspection signed off 11:40 at night by a technician named on the form as R. Danvers. Except Ashcombe had never employed a technician named R. Danvers. Not that year. Not any year Reese had ever heard of. She scrolled further. There was a second sheet, a maintenance discrepancy log, and on it a notation about a torque wrench checked out of the tool crib at 23:14 hours and never checked back in until 05:30 the next morning. 6 hours. 6 hours a tool sat missing from inventory. The night before her hydraulic system failed at 9,000 feet. Because that wasn't carelessness. Careless people didn't invent employee names. Careless people didn't check tools back in at exactly the hour shift change, made nobody look too closely. "Because somebody signed a name that didn't exist," she said out loud, mostly to herself, her voice gone thin. "Which means somebody's wanted a paper trail that looked clean. Which means somebody knew exactly what they were covering." "Ma'am, if this is what I think it is, it's sabotage, Petrov." She said it flat, final, the way you'd read a verdict. "Somebody cut into my hydraulic lines the night before that flight, and somebody else made sure the maintenance record wouldn't point back to them." Her mind went unbidden to her father. To a 2-paragraph statement and a board that closed his file even faster than they'd closed hers. 2 accidents. 2 impossible engineers. 2 files that closed too fast, 12 years apart, both belonging to a Callahan. She didn't say that part out loud. Not yet. Some thoughts needed time before they were ready to survive daylight. Her mind was already running ahead of her. Sprinting through 2 years of humiliation, 2 years of Trammell's jokes in Ashwell's cold office, and her own hands scrubbing pots at 4 in the morning, and underneath all of it this. This had been sitting in a file the entire time, waiting, until she found it. Except finding it didn't fix anything. Didn't clear her name. Didn't put her back in a cockpit. All it did was confirm the thing she'd known in her gut since the day she woke up in a hospital bed with a concussion and a general standing over her, telling her the accident was her fault. She hadn't failed. She'd been failed, on purpose, by someone, and there wasn't time to unravel who. Not with men bleeding out on Highway 9 while she stood behind a hangar, staring at a name that didn't exist. Petrov. Her voice came back hard, back present. Keep this safe. Don't tell anyone. Not yet. Where are you going? She was already walking. The flight line at Ashcombe held 2 A-10s that morning. Both fueled, both armed, both sitting in the sun like the only 2 adults left in a room full of children, too scared to move. Reese walked toward them the way she used to walk toward everything that mattered. Steady, unhurried, like the ground itself owed her passage. Behind her distantly, she heard her name being called. Petrov probably, or someone from the operations building who'd finally noticed the cook was walking somewhere she had no business walking. She didn't turn around, because turning around meant explaining, and explaining meant giving somebody the chance to say no. One more time, and she'd had 2 years of no, she wasn't giving anybody a third chance to say it again today. Sergeant Ruiz, the crew chief, looked up from his clipboard and did a double take that would have been funny under any other circumstance. Captain Callahan. He blinked, actually blinked like she might be a heat mirage. Ma'am, what are you? I need a jet, Sergeant. You're not cleared. I know. Ma'am, I could lose my stripes for this. You could lose 2 men on Highway 9 if you don't. She held his gaze steady, unblinking. I flew this exact bird for 3 years before I got grounded for something I didn't do. I know every panel, every switch, every quirk she's got. You know I do. Ruiz's eyes flicked toward the operations building, then back to her, then down at the clipboard in his hands like it might have an answer written on it somewhere. You remember Reyes's bird has that sticky trim wheel? He said slowly. Not really a question. More like a man, testing whether the person in front of him was really who she said she was. Left side needs a firm tap before it'll seat right, same as it did 3 years ago. She didn't blink. You want me to name the fuel mixture ratio too, Sergeant, or are we done auditioning? Something in Ruiz's face shifted, not quite a smile. Something closer to recognition. They'll court-martial you, he said quietly. They can get in line. Somewhere behind them, a klaxon started up low and urgent. The kind of sound that meant somebody in the operations room had finally realized just how bad Highway 9 had gotten. Voices shouting, boots running. The whole base waking up to a crisis it had no one qualified to answer. Reese looked up at the aircraft in front of her. At the nose art, faded now, at the worn canopy glass that had once framed her whole world. Because this was the moment. The one her father used to talk about in the garage all those years ago, the moment where the room's on fire and somebody has to be the calmest person in it. Except nobody had asked her to be that person today. Nobody had given her permission. She was going to be her anyway. Sergeant Ruiz. Her voice dropped low, urgent, final. Help me get this bird in the air, or step aside and let me do it myself. Either way, I'm flying. For one more second, he didn't move. And then he set down the clipboard. Pre-flight's gonna take 4 minutes, he said, already moving toward the ladder. You remember how to do it in 3? For the first time in 2 years, something that might have been a smile crossed Reese Callahan's face. Watch me. The cockpit still smelled the same. That was the first thing that hit her, climbing up into a seat she hadn't touched in 731 days. She knew the number she'd counted. She always counted the smell of hydraulic fluid and metal and something faintly electrical that never quite went away, no matter how many times maintenance cleaned the panels. Her hands moved before her mind fully caught up. Switches, gauges. The particular choreography of a pre-flight sequence carved so deep into muscle memory that 2 years of scrubbing pots hadn't managed to scrape it out. Because some things didn't leave you. Not really. They just went quiet, waiting for the moment you needed them again. Her fingers found the canopy rail. Cold metal, sun-warmed, on one edge, familiar in a way that made her throat tighten before she could stop it. 2 years she'd told herself she was fine. 2 years she'd told herself the kitchen was fine, the mockery was fine. The slow erasure of everything she used to be was something she could live inside without it costing her anything. It had cost her everything. She just hadn't let herself notice until right now, with her hands back where they belonged and her whole chest suddenly too full to hold. No time for that. Not now. Grief could wait its turn behind the checklist. Below her, Ruiz was already moving fast around the aircraft, doing in 3 minutes what usually took 10. Calling things up to her that she answered on instinct, half her brain running. Pre-flight, half of it, running straight back to a garage in Elko and a man cleaning a rifle scope telling her fear was just information. The engines caught. Both of them, one after the other, that particular shuddering roar that had once been the most familiar sound in her entire life and now hit her ears like something out of a dream she'd stopped letting herself have. Radio traffic crackled through her headset. Petrov's voice cutting through tight with something between panic and disbelief. Ashcombe Tower, be advised, unauthorized aircraft on the active. Belay that. Ruiz's voice gruff, final, cutting across the channel like a closed door. She's cleared. I'm signing off on it. Ruiz, you don't have the authority to. I've got a wrench and a conscience, Petrov. That's all the authority I need today. Reese almost laughed. Almost. There wasn't room for it, not with the engines spooling up beneath her. Not with the whole weight of Highway 9 sitting somewhere out past the horizon, waiting on a woman the Air Force had spent 2 years insisting didn't matter anymore. She taxied onto the runway. General Ashwell's voice came through the radio next, sharp, furious, exactly the voice she'd expected. Callahan. Callahan, abort this. That is a direct order. She didn't answer. Callahan, do you copy? Abort the taxi. This is your last warning before I have you removed from that aircraft. Still nothing. Just the sound of her own breathing, steady now, steadier than it had been in 2 years, filling up the small space of her helmet like something coming back online after a long, cold sleep. Because there wasn't time to explain herself to a man who'd had 2 years to ask the right questions and never once bothered. Because somewhere out there, men were dying for lack of exactly what she had hands. That knew this aircraft better than her own reflection and a reason bigger than her own pride to fly it. And because somewhere in a locked file cabinet back on that base sat proof that the woman they'd called broken had been sabotaged, cut down on purpose. By someone who was still out there, still hiding. She'd deal with that. She would. Just not yet. Behind her in the operations building, Lieutenant Colonel Holt stood frozen at the window, watching an A-10 roll toward the runway that wasn't supposed to have a pilot in it. Ashwell was shouting into a radio behind him, and Petrov was pale as chalk near the comms desk. And somewhere in the chaos of it, Holt found himself doing something he hadn't expected. Smiling. Just slightly. Just enough that nobody else in the room noticed it. That's my girl, he thought, though. He'd never once said those words to her out loud. Not once in 2 years of watching her scrub pots and take insults from men who weren't fit to shine her boots. That's exactly what your father would have done. He didn't know yet how much that thought would come to cost him, how the truth waiting behind those maintenance logs would eventually point somewhere he never wanted her to look. For now he only watched chest tight with something between pride and dread as the jet picked up speed. Right now there was a highway full of men who needed the sky to open up and save them. Reese Callahan pushed the throttle forward, and the engines roared, and the aircraft that had once been taken from her lifted off the ground like it had simply been waiting all this time for her to come back and claim it. The G-force pressed her into the seat, familiar and violent and exactly right. And for one suspended second she let herself feel it fully. 2 years of scrubbed pots and swallowed insults and quiet private grief. All of it lifting off the tarmac along with the landing gear. All of it finally physically leaving the ground. Behind her, Ashcombe shrank into a smear of tan buildings and chain-link fence. Somewhere down there. Trammell was probably still standing in the mess hall doorway, tray forgotten mouth still open around whatever joke he'd been about to make. Ahead of her, the desert opened up, wide and merciless and burning under the morning sun. Her father's voice came to her then, unbidden, the way it always did in moments like this. Fear's not the problem, Reese. The problem is letting it drive. She wasn't letting it drive. Not today. Because 2 years of silence had just ended the second her wheels left the tarmac. Because somewhere in a file cabinet back at Ashcombe sat proof that somebody had tried to erase her once already and nearly succeeded. Because whoever had cut those hydraulic lines 2 years ago was still out there, still hiding, still certain the truth would stay buried forever. They were wrong. She was going to make sure of it. But first there was a highway. First there were men who had no idea. A miracle was already screaming toward them at 400 knots, flown by a woman. The Air Force had spent 2 years insisting didn't matter anymore. 40 miles east, Foster had run out of things to say to keep Reyes Marsh talking. The bleeding had slowed, which scared him more than when it had been fast, and the gunfire from the ridge had changed rhythm, gone patient the way shooters got when they knew they had all the time in the world, and their targets had none. "Hey," his voice cracked on it. "Hey, stay with me." Reyes Marsh's eyes were open, barely, fixed on something past Foster's shoulder, past the ridge, past the whole burning morning. "Bike," he mumbled. "Tell her about the bike." "You're telling her yourself?" Foster grabbed his radio one more time, pressed the switch so hard his thumb went white. Anybody copy? We are running out of time out here," static answered him. And then just barely underneath the static, something new. A frequency shift, a voice distant but growing, cutting through an hour of dead air like the first crack of daylight through a door that had been shut too long. "Highway 9 convoy, this is Widow 1-1. I have you on scope. ETA 4 minutes. Hold what you've got." Foster stared at the radio like it had spoken in a language he'd forgotten he understood. "Say again," he breathed. "Say your call sign again." "Widow 1-1, inbound hot. Keep your heads down." He had no idea whose voice that was. No idea it belonged to a woman who earlier that same morning had been dicing onions in a base kitchen, a world away from anyone who still called her captain. All he knew was that for the first time in an hour, help sounded real. They had no idea it was already in the air. And somewhere behind her in a base, she'd justified every rule to leave. The first domino had already started to fall, one that would not stop until it had torn down everything Reese Callahan thought she knew about who she could trust. For now, though, none of that mattered. Not the file cabinet, not the sabotage, not the 14 years of silence still waiting, unopened somewhere ahead of her. Right now, there was only the desert, the throttle steady beneath her hand, and a highway full of strangers who were about to learn in the space of a single gun run exactly what kind of woman the Air Force had spent 2 years insisting didn't matter anymore. She banked toward the smoke rising off Highway 9 and flew. The smoke on Highway 9 grew larger, with every second a smudge of gray-black rising off the desert floor, like something the earth itself was trying to cough up. Reese Callahan watched it climb through her canopy glass throttle-steady mind, narrowing down to the single clean equation her father had spent a childhood teaching her to solve without panic. The ridge came up fast. 2,000 feet, then 1,000, the desert floor rushing toward her canopy like something that wanted to be looked at up close. Reese Callahan didn't blink, because there wasn't room for blinking, not with 3 vehicles pinned against a rock embankment 40 miles from anywhere. Not with muzzle flashes stuttering from 2 elevated positions like something out of a nightmare she used to have and stopped having, only because she stopped letting herself sleep deep enough to dream. Her instruments glowed steady in front of her. Airspeed, altitude. The targeting reticle sliding across terrain she'd flown over 100 times in training, and never once with lives actually riding on the accuracy of her hands. Because a training was theory, this was the thing itself. Widow 1-1, be advised, hostiles at your 10 and 2 elevated positions, danger close to friendlies. Foster's voice ragged, disbelieving like a man talking to a ghost he still wasn't sure was real. Repeat, danger close. Copy, danger close. Her own voice came out steadier than she felt. Pop smoke on your position. Confirm friendlies. A beat. Then red smoke bloomed up from behind the lead vehicle, curling sideways in the wind. Tally smoke, she said. Coming around hot. She banked the aircraft hard, G-force pressing her into the seat, the whole world tilting sideways for one long, breathless second. Because this was the part nobody understood unless they'd done it. Not the shooting. The math. 30 knots too fast, and she'd overshoot the target. 10 degrees too shallow, and she'd walk round straight into the convoy she was trying to save. Wind correction. Angle of attack. The particular geometry of a gun run that had to thread a needle between saving 3 lives and ending them by half a degree of error. Her father's voice somewhere underneath the noise. Calm's not the absence of fear, Reese. Calm's what you do with it. She lined up the gun's sight, watched the ridge slide into the crosshairs like it had been waiting there the whole time, just for her, and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 came alive beneath her, that impossible bone-deep growl that didn't sound like a gun, so much as the earth itself clearing its throat, and 30 millimeters of high-explosive incendiary rounds tore into the ridge exactly where the muzzle flashes had been. Rock, dust, silence sudden and enormous, where gunfire had been a permanent fixture 90 seconds before. She pulled up hard, banking away from the smoke and debris, scanning the ridgeline for any movement that would mean she needed to come back around and do it again. Nothing moved. Nothing but settling dust and a silence so complete it felt like its own kind of proof. "Splash," she said, quiet now, the adrenaline already draining out through her hands. "Hostiles neutralized. Highway 9 convoy, you are clear." For 3 full seconds, nobody answered. Then Foster's voice came back, cracked wide open, with something too big for a radio to carry. "Widow 1-1, this is... I don't even know what to thank you." "Thank you, whoever you are." She didn't answer that either. Some things a person had to just let sit in the air unclaimed, because claiming them felt like asking for a medal she wasn't sure she'd earned back yet. Below her, 3 vehicles that had been minutes from becoming a memorial started moving again. Slow at first, then faster, then gone, disappearing down Highway 9 toward the checkpoint that would keep them alive for one more day. Reese Callahan banked the aircraft back toward Ashcombe and felt for the first time in 731 days like herself. News on a base that size traveled faster than any aircraft. By the time Reese's wheels touched down, the story had already made 3 full laps of Ashcombe, growing a little wilder, with each telling the cook who stole a jet, the cook who saved a convoy, the cook who wasn't a cook at all. In the mess hall, Dell heard it from a supply clerk who'd heard it from someone in comms, and he stood frozen behind the serving line, with a ladle of gravy suspended halfway to a tray, mouth open, not moving until the gravy started dripping onto the floor. "No way," he said mostly to himself. "No way." He set the ladle down, wiped his hands on his apron, and looked out the mess hall window toward the flight line, half expecting to see the whole thing had been some elaborate joke. It wasn't. Word kept coming more specific with each pass, until even Dell, who'd known her longer than almost anyone on this base, had to sit down on an overturned crate and simply absorb it. 2 years he'd been quietly wondering about the woman who diced onions, like she was diffusing something. Now he finally understood why. At a table near the window, Trammell heard it too. Watched the color drain slowly out of his own face as the story reached him. Second hand, third hand, exactly as unbelievable each time it repeated. Callahan. Their Callahan. Flying combat sorties over Highway 9 while he'd spent the morning mocking her for burning bacon. I didn't say anything. For once, Boyd Trammell had absolutely nothing to say. Because there was a particular kind of silence that came from watching your own joke turn out to be aimed at someone who could have flown circles around you the entire time you were laughing. Even Figueroa, the young clerk from the front office, found her way into the mess hall on her break, drawn by the same current of disbelief, pulling half the base toward any scrap of information. She'd been the one who'd heard the shouting through Ashwell's door that morning, and now hearing what had come after. She felt something close to awe settle over the whole strange sequence of events. The door she'd sat frozen outside of had been the opening act to something extraordinary, and she'd had no idea at the time. Major Weston Sutton heard the story sitting in the flight surgeon's waiting room, wrist still wrapped from the PT mishap that had grounded him 3 weeks running, and he didn't believe a word of it at first. "The cook," he said flat to the airman who'd brought him the news, like it was gossip worth interrupting a man's physical therapy over. "Callahan, the one who burns the toast. Flew a full gun run over Highway 9, sir. Saved a convoy. Ashwell's got her confined to quarters over it." Sutton had laughed. Actually laughed short and disbelieving, the kind of laugh that came from a man certain he was hearing a joke that hadn't landed yet. He'd flown with plenty of women in his career. Respected most of them. But Callahan Callahan had been the punchline of half the mess hall for 2 years running, and punchlines didn't suddenly turn into gun-run pilots overnight, not in his experience, not. Without somebody exaggerating a story somewhere between the flight line and the rumor mill, except the airman wasn't smiling. And Ruiz, when Sutton asked him directly an hour later, wasn't smiling either. "She flew it clean, sir," Ruiz said in a tone that left no room for argument. "Better than clean. You should have seen her pre-flight. 3 minutes flat, and she hadn't touched a jet in 2 years. Sutton didn't say anything to that. He just sat with it uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name, turning over 2 years of jokes he'd laughed along with, even when he hadn't started them himself. He told himself it didn't matter. Told himself grounded was grounded, wrist or no wrist, and none of this changed anything for him personally. He had no idea, sitting there with his wrist in a brace and his pride slightly bruised, how wrong that would eventually turn out to be. The reception waiting for her on the tarmac was not a parade. General Ashwell stood at the edge of the flight line, with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way of a man deciding in real time how much trouble he was in, for the trouble somebody else had caused. Behind him, 2 security forces airmen stood at something close to attention, unsure whether they were here to salute her or arrest her. Reese popped the canopy and climbed down the ladder into a silence so total she could hear the engines ticking as they cooled. "Captain Callahan?" Ashwell's voice flat, furious, controlled in the way that scared her more than shouting would have. "You are relieved of duty, effective immediately. You will surrender your identification and report to my office for formal charges." "Yes, sir." "You disobeyed a direct order. You stole a military aircraft. You saved 3 men who would be dead right now if I hadn't." She said it quietly, not defiant, just true. "I'll take whatever's coming, sir. I'd do it again first." Something in his face twitched. Not quite a crack, just a hairline fracture in a wall he'd built a long time ago and reinforced every day since. "My office," he said. Now. 14 years earlier, a different office, a different desk, a different Callahan standing across from a different commanding officer, though Reese hadn't known that then. Hadn't known any of it, not really. Really not until 3 days before the funeral, when her father called home, sounding like a man watching something through a window he wished he could close. "Something's wrong out here, Reese." He'd laughed after he said it. That laugh that always meant he was trying to make something smaller than it actually was. Probably nothing. Probably just an old man seeing shadows where there aren't any. "What kind of shadows, Dad?" "Meow. Paperwork stuff, boring stuff, don't worry about it." She hadn't worried about it. She was 12. 12-year-olds didn't worry about paperwork. 12-year-olds worried about whether their dad would make it home in time for a birthday. And hers was in 6 days, and he'd absolutely promised. And 3 days after that phone call, he was dead, and the birthday never happened, and nobody ever mentioned the shadows again. She remembered the last thing he'd said before hanging up that night. The thing she hadn't understood until years later, sitting alone in a kitchen with a knife in her hand and a life she didn't recognize as her own. "If anything ever happens to me, Reese, you look for the people who go quiet the fastest. Quiet's not innocent. Quiet's just quiet till you prove otherwise." She'd asked him what he meant. He'd laughed it off again, told her to go do her homework, told her he loved her, told her he'd see her Saturday. Saturday never came. Until now. Until a maintenance log with a name that didn't exist and a torque wrench missing for 6 hours the night before. Her own hydraulic system failed at 9,000 feet. Because 2 accidents didn't happen by coincidence. Not to the same family. Not 12 years apart with the same base, the same silence, the same convenient conclusion, arriving faster than any investigation should. She hadn't said any of that to Ashwell. Not yet. Some truths needed armor before they went out into the world, and hers wasn't built yet. "You have exactly one reason I'm not throwing the book at you right now." Ashwell sat behind his desk, hands flat on the surface, like he was holding it down, holding himself down. "And that reason is currently alive on Highway 9 because of what you did up there." "I understand, sir." "Do you?" He looked at her for a long moment. "Because from where I'm sitting, Captain, you just handed me a mess I have no idea how to clean up. Insubordination, theft of government property, unauthorized combat action. That's not a slap on the wrist. That's a court-martial. Then court-martial me. She held his gaze. But do it after you look at what Airman Petrov found in the maintenance archive. Do it after you explain to me why nobody's asked in 2 years. Why a torque wrench went missing for 6 hours the night before my hydraulics failed. Ashwell went very still. Say that again. She said it again, slower this time, watched every word land like a stone dropped down a well too deep to hear it hit bottom. When she finished, the general didn't speak for a long time. He stood, walked to the window, looked out at the same flight line that had watched 2 decades of his career come and go. If what you're telling me is true, he said finally, then somebody on this base sabotaged a military aircraft and let it fly with your name on the flight plan. Yes, sir. And you're telling me this now, after you already stole a second aircraft and flew it without authorization. I'm telling you now because now was when I found out, sir, and because those men on Highway 9 weren't going to wait for the timing to be convenient. He exhaled long and slow, the sound of a man doing math he didn't want to be doing. Who else knows about this? Just Airman Petrov, sir, and now you. Keep it that way, for now. He rubbed a hand across his jaw, the gesture of a man calculating risk in real time. If there's rot in this command, I don't know yet how deep it goes, and I'm not about to hand a warning to whoever's responsible by making noise before I understand the shape of what I'm dealing with. I'll pull the file myself, he said, personally. No one touches it but me until I understand what I'm looking at. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, Captain. He turned back to her, and for the first time in 2 years, something in his face looked less like a wall and more like a man who was tired of being lied to. If this is real, it doesn't just clear you. It means somebody in my command tried to kill one of my pilots and covered it up well enough that it worked. That's not a court-martial problem anymore. That's a different kind of problem entirely. What happens to me in the meantime, sir? You're confined to quarters pending review. No flight line, no investigation of your own. You let me handle this through proper channels. He held up a hand before she could argue. I know how that sounds, given everything. But, Captain, if there is something rotten in this command, the last thing either of us needs is you charging at it alone and getting yourself killed before anyone in a position to actually do something about it even knows what they're looking at. She didn't like it, but she nodded anyway because arguing further would only cost her the one thing she needed most right now, which was a commanding officer who'd finally started asking the right questions instead of burying them. Dismissed, Captain, and Callahan. He paused as she reached the door. For what it's worth, what you did up there today. That was the pilot I always thought you were before this whole mess started. I should have fought harder for you 2 years ago. I didn't. That's on me. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was closer to one than she'd expected to ever hear from him, and she carried it out of that office like something fragile she wasn't quite ready to look at too closely. Confined to quarters meant something different on a base like Ashcom than it might have meant somewhere with actual walls worth confining a person behind. It meant her room, the mess hall, at off hours, and nowhere else, with an airman posted outside her door who looked more embarrassed by the assignment than she was insulted by it. Ruiz found a way around it anyway. He always did. Brought you something, he said, appearing at her window an hour after sundown with a paper bag that smelled like the good coffee, not the base coffee, and look on his face like a man who'd broken at least 2 regulations just getting there. You're not supposed to be here, Sergeant. Neither are you supposed to be famous, but here we both are. He passed the bag through the window, glancing back over his shoulder, out of habit more than actual worry. Whole base is talking about you, you know. Foster's putting in for a commendation nomination. Trammell's gone so quiet, the mess hall thinks he's sick. Despite everything, she laughed. A real laugh, short and surprised, the first one that had gotten all the way out of her in longer than she wanted to admit. How bad's the fallout looking? Ruiz asked, more serious now. Depends who you ask. Ashwell's pulling the maintenance file himself. Says if what I found is real, it's bigger than just clearing my name. Ruiz's face went careful in a way she recognized the particular stillness of a man who'd been on this base long enough to have his own instincts about which stones were safe to look under. You be careful digging around in that, he said quietly. I've heard things over the years. Nothing solid, just enough that I learned not to ask questions about certain cargo runs. He held her gaze. You start pulling threads. Captain, you want to make sure you know who's on the other end before you pull too hard. What kind of things, Sergeant? He hesitated, and for a moment she thought he might actually tell her. Then something closed back over his expression, old habit reasserting itself. Nothing I could ever prove. Just odd manifests sometimes. Flights that didn't match their paperwork. A crew chief learns to keep his head down about that sort of thing if he wants to keep his stripes long enough to retire on them. He shrugged, but it didn't quite land as casual as he wanted it to. 12 years I've kept my head down about it. Guess that streak's about to end too, one way or another. She thought of Holt, of the half-second hesitation in his eyes that afternoon by the equipment shed. She didn't say his name out loud, not yet. Thanks for the coffee, Sergeant. Thanks for not getting yourself killed today, he said, already backing away from the window. Try to keep that streak going. Lieutenant Colonel Holt found her the next morning, sitting on the same stack of pallets by the equipment shed, coffee gone cold in her hands the way it always did lately. Heard you flew yesterday, he said, easing himself down beside her. Heard right. Heard you might be looking at a court-martial. Heard that too? He was quiet for a moment, watching the flight line the same way he always did. Like it owed him an answer to a question he'd stopped asking out loud years ago. Your father would have been proud, he said. And terrified. Probably in that order. She almost smiled. Almost. Then something in her chest tightened, and before she could stop herself, the words were already out. Sir, can I ask you something? Always. Did my father ever mention anything to you, before he died? About trouble on base? Paperwork stuff, he called it. Shadows. Something moved behind Holt's eyes. Something moved behind. Quick. Gone before she could name it. Your father was a careful man, he said slowly. If something was bothering him, he wouldn't have spread it around. But you'd know. If anyone would, it'd be you. Why do you ask? She hesitated. Some instinct old and quiet told her to hold the rest back, just for now, just until she understood more than she did. No reason, she said. Just missing him today, I guess. Holt nodded slowly, like a man accepting an answer he didn't quite believe. He'd be proud of you, Reese. His voice had gone softer. Whatever happens with this court-martial business, don't forget that. She didn't answer. She just watched him walk away, and for reasons she couldn't name yet, she found herself replaying the exact half-second delay before he'd answered her question. The way his easy voice had gone for just an instant, careful in a way it had never been careful with her before. She told herself it was nothing. She was wrong. Petrov was waiting for her behind the hangar laptop, already open-faced, pale in the way of a man who'd found something he badly wished he hadn't. Ma'am, you need to see this. What is it? After you told me to dig deeper, I pulled personnel assignment records, cross-referenced with the maintenance archive, trying to figure out who actually had access to your aircraft that night. His hands were shaking slightly on the keyboard. There's a supply requisition, dated 11 days before your accident, for hydraulic line components, requisitioned under a maintenance work order that doesn't correspond to any scheduled service on your aircraft. Who filed it? That's the thing, ma'am. He turned the laptop toward her. The requisition doesn't have a name on it, just an authorization code. But I checked which officer holds that authorization level. Reese's chest went cold before she even saw the name. Ma'am, Petrov said, quieter now. It's Lieutenant Colonel Holt. She didn't move for a long moment. The desert kept doing what deserts did. Burning indifferent, the same as it had been an hour ago. When she still believed the only person on this base who saw her clearly was the same man whose name just landed in her chest like a dropped bomb. That's not proof of anything, she said finally. and her voice came out thinner than she wanted it to. Authorization codes get shared, delegated. That could mean nothing. Could. Petrov didn't look convinced, and neither did she, because nothing about it felt like nothing. Because Holt had hesitated just now, just for half a second, when she asked about her father. Because Holt had access. Because Holt had motive she hadn't found yet, but could feel circling somewhere just out of reach. The way you feel a storm before you see the clouds. Except she'd known this man 14 years. Except he'd sat beside her father in cockpits she'd only ever heard stories about. Except he was the one person who still called her captain and made her believe it, which meant one of two things had to be true. Either the evidence was wrong, or everything she thought she knew about the people she trusted was about to come apart at the seams. "Ma'am," Petrov said carefully, "what do you want to do?" She thought about her father's voice on that last phone call. Something's wrong out here, Reese. Probably nothing. It hadn't been nothing. She understood that now with a clarity that felt almost violent. "I want to know everything Holt's been doing for the last 2 years, she said. "Every assignment, every requisition, every trip off base. Quietly, Petrov. If he's involved in this, he can't know we're looking. And if he's not, then I've wasted your time and mine, and I'll apologize to him myself." She stood brushing dust off her knees, her jaw set in a line that would have made her father proud and worried in exactly the order he always managed both. "But I don't think I'm wasting anyone's time. I think somebody's been protecting a secret on this base for 14 years, and I think it's time somebody finally asked the right questions." The days that followed moved strange. Slow in daylight when Reese was confined to quarters pending the outcome of Ashwell's investigation. Forbidden from the flight line, forbidden technically from doing anything except waiting. Fast at night when Petrov slipped digitized files onto a drive he kept buried 3 folders deep under a name so boring nobody would ever think to look twice. Because that was how you hid something important. Not behind a locked door, behind boredom, behind a name so unremarkable it repelled curiosity on contact. She learned things in pieces. A supply requisition for aircraft components that never showed up in any maintenance log. A pattern of unscheduled trips off base, always timed to coincide with cargo transfers that had nothing to do with training exercises. Fuel records that didn't match flight hours, logged. Personnel rosters with names on transport manifests who, according to every other record on file, weren't supposed to be anywhere near this base that week. Some nights she worked until her eyes burned the small light of Petrov's contraband laptop. The only illumination in a room she wasn't technically allowed to be doing any of this in. She thought more than once about her father sitting at a similar desk 14 years earlier, her piecing together the same kind of quiet damning pattern alone, with no daughter yet old enough to help him carry the weight of what he'd found. She wondered if he'd felt this same mixture of dread and clarity. She suspected he had. And a name that kept surfacing in old records from 14 years back. Not Holt's name, not exactly, but a designation, a call sign used on radio logs. The week her father died, one that matched no pilot on the roster at the time. Widow Actual. She stared at that call sign a long time the first night she found it. Widow Actual. The same naming convention she'd used herself without thinking when she checked in over Highway 9. Widow 11. A designation passed down through generations of pilots, at this base inherited, reused meaningless on its own. Except this one had been used the night before her father's crash, on a frequency that didn't match any scheduled training exercise, communicating with a ground unit that, according to every official record, hadn't existed. She spent an entire night cross-referencing flight logs against cargo manifests. Petrov feeding her scanned pages through a gap in her window screen, like they were passing contraband, which she supposed in a sense they were. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, she found the pattern she hadn't let herself look for directly. Every 18 months, almost exactly, a transport flight logged as routine maintenance rotation that carried cargo weights inconsistent with any maintenance parts requisition on file. 18 months, 14 years, 9 cycles give or take of something moving through this base that was never supposed to exist on paper at all. Because somebody had been running something off the books 14 years ago, long before Reese was old enough to understand what shadows her father had seen. Something involving aircraft cargo and a radio designation that had apparently outlived the man who first used it. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, hiding in plain sight for over a decade, sat the answer to why her father died, and why her hydraulics failed, and why two Callahans, 12 years apart, had both been quietly, efficiently erased. She confronted Holt on a Thursday 3 days before her hearing in the same equipment shed where he'd always found her first. She'd rehearsed it a dozen different ways. The night before, lying awake in the dark, trying out sentences that all sounded either too accusatory or too gentle, neither of which felt like the right size for what she actually needed to say. In the end, she decided against rehearsal entirely. Some conversations, her father used to say, you didn't practice. You just walked into the room and let the truth find its own words. Except this time she found him first. "Sir?" Her voice was steady, steadier than she felt. "I need to ask you about something, and I need you to be honest with me." Holt looked up from whatever paperwork he'd been pretending to read, and something in his face changed the moment he saw her expression. Some careful, practiced calm, sliding into place like a mask he'd worn so long it fit like skin. "Of course, Captain. Anything. Widow actual." She watched his face while she said it, watched for the flicker. "Does that mean anything to you?" For one long moment, Holt didn't answer. And in that silence, Reese felt something inside her chest finish breaking slow and total. The way ice finally gives after holding weight far longer than it should have. Because he hadn't asked her to repeat it, hadn't asked what she meant. A man with nothing to hide asks what you mean. He just sat there and said nothing. Which was in its own quiet way an answer loud enough to end everything she'd believed about him. "Where did you hear that?" he said finally. "Careful, too careful." "Does it matter, sir? You know exactly what it means. I can see it on your face." "Reese, don't." Her voice cracked just slightly, just enough to let 14 years of grief leak through the edges of it. "Don't say my name like that. Not until you tell me the truth. Were you there the night my father died? Were you widow actual?" Holt closed his eyes. And when he opened them again, something in him had changed too. Something tired. Something that had been carrying a weight for so long it had forgotten how to put it down. "You don't understand what you're stepping into," he said quietly. "This isn't something I can just explain to you in an equipment shed, Reese. There are people involved. People who are still what? Still watching him," he said, "still protecting what they built. Your father found out too much too fast, and it cost him everything. I have spent 14 years trying to make sure it didn't cost you the same thing." The words hit her like turbulence, like the floor of the aircraft dropping out from under her at altitude. "You knew." Her voice had gone to a whisper. "You knew what happened to him this whole time, and you let me believe it was an accident. I let you believe it because the alternative would have gotten you killed too." Holt stood, and for the first time since she'd known him, he looked old. Genuinely, completely old, the weight of every year showing at once. "I have spent a decade and a half protecting Warwick Callahan's daughter from the same people who took him. Do you understand that everything I have done, including sabotaging my aircraft?" The question came out of her like something torn loose. Was that protection too? Something in his face collapsed. "That wasn't me," he said. That was them making sure you never dug deep enough to find what I've been trying to keep buried. I didn't authorize it. I didn't know until after. And when I found out, He stopped, swallowed hard. "I told myself grounding you was safer than the alternative. I told myself a kitchen was better than a grave." Silence stretched between them, thick enough to choke on. "Then help me stop it." "I can't." His voice cracked on the words. "If I move against them now, everything I've built to keep you safe collapses with it. They'll know I talked, and they will not hesitate a second time. Then I'll do it without you. Reese, you've had 14 years, sir." She stepped back from him, chest, heaving eyes burning in a way she refused to let become tears. Not here, not in front of him. 14 years to tell me the truth. I'm done waiting for you to decide when I'm allowed to know it. You think I wanted this? His voice rose for the first time, cracking under a weight she'd never once heard him carry in 14 years of knowing him. You think I chose to stand at your father's funeral, watching his 12-year-old daughter in a dress 2 sizes too big, and decide right then that keeping my mouth shut was the only way to keep her alive long enough to grow up. I have hated myself every single day since Reese. Every commendation I watched you earn. Every time Trammell made a fool of himself, mocking a woman worth 10 of him. I stood there and I said nothing, because saying something meant you might end up exactly where your father ended up. So instead you let me believe I failed. Her voice broke on the word, finally, after holding steady through everything else. You let me believe 2 years of my life were my own fault. You watched me scrub pots and take insults from men who weren't fit to shine my boots, and you called it protecting me. I called it the only option I could live with. He looked older in that moment than she had ever seen him, the weight of a decade and a half settling visibly into his shoulders. I was wrong. I see that now watching your face. I was wrong to think silence was ever going to be safer than the truth. It just delayed the bill. It didn't cancel it. Did you ever think about telling me? Her voice had gone quieter, almost curious now, beneath the anger, like she genuinely needed to know. In 14 years, even once. Every single day, he said it simply without flinching. And every single day I talked myself out of it, because the version of you I imagined telling was still 12 years old, standing at a funeral in a dress that didn't fit. I never let myself picture the version of you who actually grew up. That was my failure, Reese. Not just the silence, the refusal to believe you could carry it. She stood there a long moment, breathing hard, trying to decide whether 14 years of quiet loyalty could outweigh 14 years of silence about the one thing that mattered most. No, it couldn't, not yet. Maybe not ever. But there wasn't time to sort grief from fury, not with men in this conversation who had already proven they were willing to let people die to keep a secret buried. Who are they? Reese said finally. The people who did this, who killed my father, who tried to kill me. Holt looked at her for a long moment, and something in his eyes. Some last flicker of the man who used to sit beside her by this same shed telling her stories about a father she barely remembered seemed to make a decision. There's a shipment, he said quietly. Coming through this base in 4 days. Military components diverted off the books for over a decade, sold to buyers who were never supposed to have them. It's bigger than anything you've imagined, Reese. And it's about to happen again right here, unless somebody stops it. She turned and walked away before he could say anything else. Behind her, Preston Holt stood alone in the equipment shed, staring at the space where she'd been standing a decade and a half of careful silence, finally irreversibly broken. She didn't make it back to her quarters. 2 security forces airmen intercepted her halfway across the flight line, faces carefully blank in the way of men following orders they didn't fully understand. Captain Callahan, General Ashwell needs to see you immediately. Something cold slid down her spine. Is this about my hearing? I wasn't briefed on the details, ma'am. Just told to bring you in. She followed them across the tarmac, mind racing through every possibility, none of them good. Because timing like this wasn't coincidence. Not an hour after she'd confronted Holt. Not with a shipment 4 days out and a man who just admitted to protecting a 14-year-old conspiracy, suddenly aware that she knew. Ashwell's office door was already open when they arrived. And the general wasn't alone. Major Grady Voss stood beside his desk. Arms crossed, expression unreadable. And beside him, unmistakably, stood 2 men in plain civilian suits that somehow managed to look more threatening than any uniform on base. Captain Callahan. Ashwell's voice was tight, controlled in a way that told her something had gone badly wrong since she'd left his office 3 days ago. These gentlemen are from an agency I'm not at liberty to name. They have some questions for you about a maintenance investigation you initiated. Reese's eyes moved between the men, calculating already 3 steps ahead of the room, the way she always was, in a cockpit under fire. Sir, with respect, I'd like to know exactly what's happening here. One of the suited men stepped forward, calm, unhurried. The kind of calm that came from never once in his entire career having needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Behind him, the second man hadn't moved from his position near the door, hands folded, watching the room the way a man watches a chessboard rather than a conversation. And Reese understood somewhere in the cold, fast part of her mind that his silence was its own kind of message. "Captain Callahan, we understand you've been investigating irregularities in a maintenance file from 2 years ago. We understand you've also been discussing certain matters with Lieutenant Colonel Holt." His eyes were flat, unreadable, patient as a held breath. "We're going to need you to hand over everything you've found. Immediately. And we're going to need you to understand that this investigation ends today." "On whose authority?" "On authority you don't need clearance to question, Captain. Just clearance to obey." The line landed with the practiced weight of something he'd said before to other people in other rooms just like this one. A sentence worn smooth by repetition, and that smoothness frightened her more than any raw threat could have. Beside her, she saw Ashwell's jaw tighten, saw something pass behind his eyes that looked almost like an apology. He didn't have the standing left to give. Major Voss stood silent near the wall, watching the exchange with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to a man watching a scene he'd half expected to eventually happen. "And if I don't hand anything over," Reese said slowly. "What then?" "Then this becomes considerably more complicated for you than a court-martial, Captain. We would prefer that outcome for no one in this room." The man's voice never rose, never needed to. "You've been through a great deal these past 2 years. It would be a shame for it to end badly now after everything you've already survived." It wasn't a threat. Not the kind you could point to on paper. It was worse than that. It was a threat dressed up as concern, delivered so smoothly it took her a full second to feel the blade underneath the velvet of it. Because that was the moment Reese Callahan understood with a cold and total clarity that whoever these men worked for wasn't here to help her. They were here to bury her, just like they'd buried her father. Except this time she wasn't 12 years old, and she wasn't going to stand quietly at a funeral, wondering why nobody would tell her the truth. This time she had proof. A drive Petrov had hidden 3 folders deep under a name too boring to notice. A confession half given from a man who'd spent 14 years choosing silence over truth, and had just finally, in one shed on one Thursday, chosen differently. She looked at Ashwell, at the careful blankness on his face that told her without a single word passing between them that he understood exactly how dangerous this room had become and exactly how little he could do about it while these men stood inside it. "I'll need some time to gather everything," she said, finally her voice giving away nothing. "It's not all in one place." The suited man studied her for a long moment, long enough that she wondered if he could see straight through the lie sitting behind her eyes. "You have until tomorrow morning, Captain," he said finally. "We'll be in touch." They left without another word, the kind of exit that managed to feel less like men walking out of a room and more like a door, quietly, permanently closing behind them. The moment they were gone, Ashwell exhaled like he'd been holding his breath the entire meeting. "Reese?" He rarely used her first name. It landed strange urgent in a room that had just been full of people who'd used her rank like a leash. "Whatever you're planning to do with the time they just gave you, do it fast. And don't trust that it's actually until tomorrow morning. Men like that don't give real deadlines. They give countdowns." He walked to his own window, the same one he'd stood at 3 days earlier when he'd first started to believe her, and looked out at a flight line gone dark under the evening sky. "I spent 2 years being exactly the kind of officer men like that count on, Captain. Rule-bound. Slow to ask hard questions. I don't intend to keep being that officer starting tonight, but I need you to understand whatever you do next. I may not be able to protect you the way I'd like to." "I never expected you to, sir." Somewhere out past the fence line, past the desert, past every lie that had been buried for 14 years. A shipment was already moving toward this base, carrying with it the one chance she might ever get to finally bring it all into the light. She just had considerably less time than she'd hoped to figure out how to survive long enough to do it. Countdowns. Ashwell had called them, not deadlines. She kept turning the word over as she paced the length of her darkened quarters boots, silent on the floor. mind already 3 steps ahead of wherever her feet currently stood. She had until morning. Except morning was a lie, and she knew it, and Ashwell knew it too. Which meant she didn't have until morning. She had however long it took 2 men in plain suits to realize that stalling wasn't the same thing as complying. Reese Callahan stood in the dark of her quarters, back against the wall beside the window, counting her own heartbeat, because counting was the only thing that kept her hands from shaking. Because this was the moment her father would have called the narrow part of the flight. The part where the margin for error shrinks down to nothing, and the only way through is exactly precisely correct. She thought about running. For exactly 4 seconds, she let herself consider it, grabbing what evidence she could carry and disappearing into the desert on foot, becoming a story instead of a casualty. Then she thought about Highway 9, about Foster's voice cracking over the radio, about a still moving toward a runway that didn't exist on any chart, carrying with it 14 years of buried truth that would stay buried forever if she ran, instead of finishing what she'd started. Running had never once solved anything in the history of her family. Her father hadn't run from whatever he'd found 14 years ago, and it had cost him everything. But at least it had cost him everything while standing his ground, instead of fleeing from it. She wasn't going to be the Callahan who broke that particular pattern, not tonight, not for anything. Running wasn't in her. It never had been. Not really. A knock, 2 soft taps, then 3. Petrov's signal. She opened the window instead of the door. "They're moving faster than we thought," Petrov whispered, already climbing through laptop clutched to his chest like something that might shatter. "I pulled cargo manifests for tomorrow's transport rotation." "Ma'am, it's not tomorrow. It's tonight. There's a flight scheduled out of the East Apron in 90 minutes. Unmarked. No flight plan on file." "The shipment?" "Has to be." "How'd you find it this fast?" "Wasn't hard, honestly. Once you know the pattern, it practically announces itself." He set the laptop down on her footlocker, with hands that hadn't quite stopped shaking since he'd climbed through the window. "Fake maintenance rotation designation, exact same cargo weight signature as the last 8 cycles. Whoever's running this got sloppy the second they knew somebody might actually be looking, or maybe they never expected anybody to look at all. 14 years, nobody ever did." Her mind was already running the math. 90 minutes. A stolen jet if Ruiz would even risk it a second time. A general who now believed her maybe, but who was 3 ranks and several careful phone calls away from being able to actually stop anything happening in 90 minutes. "There's something else," Petrov said, and his voice had gone thin in a way that scared her more than the deadline did. "I pulled the security tasking order for tonight. There's a joint patrol scheduled along the southern perimeter road. Routine border sweep. Except what? Except it's not routine, ma'am. Somebody flagged intelligence about hostile activity in that sector 8 hours ago. Nobody can trace who filed it. And the patrol roster," he swallowed. "Major Sutton's on it. He volunteered this afternoon. Said he was tired of sitting behind a desk with a bad wrist." Reese felt something cold slide down through her chest. Because a patrol sent into a sector flagged with anonymous intelligence timed to coincide exactly with an unmarked flight moving contraband off this base wasn't a coincidence. It was bait and cover, both at once. Send a patrol out to draw attention to a fabricated threat on the southern perimeter. Let it turn into a firefight, loud enough that every eye on this base pointed the wrong direction, and while everyone was busy watching the smoke walk a shipment out the East Apron clean. Except the men on that patrol didn't know they were the diversion. They thought they were answering a real threat. They were about to become collateral in somebody else's cover story. "Weston Sutton doesn't know," she said quietly, mostly to herself. "None of them know." She closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Just long enough to let the weight of it land. A man who'd mocked her for 2 years straight was about to walk into gunfire, manufactured by people who considered him disposable. And she was the only person on this base who understood both halves of that lie well enough to stop it. Some things you didn't get to choose. You just got to decide what you did once you understood them. "Petrov," her voice had gone flat, focused the particular calm that used to come before every mission that mattered. "I need everything you have, right now. And then I need you to disappear somewhere safe, Because whatever happens in the next 90 minutes, I'm not letting you be collateral in this too. She found Holt exactly where she expected to, standing alone in the operations building at an hour when nobody with a clean conscience was still awake. He looked up when she walked in, and something in his face braced for the worst before she'd even said a word. "You came to arrest me yourself," he said. "I'd almost respect that." "I came because there's a patrol going out in 80 minutes into a sector somebody fabricated intelligence for, and I think you know exactly why." Holt's jaw tightened. "It's the diversion," he said quietly. "They're moving the whole operation tonight. Final shipment. After this, the whole thing goes dark, gets buried so deep, nobody ever finds it again. A firefight on the perimeter draws every asset on this base to the wrong side of the fence, and Sutton's patrol is the spark. They didn't plan for casualties." His voice cracked slightly. "They planned for noise, a believable engagement. Enough gunfire to justify pulling every available unit south while the transport clears north. Believable engagements have casualties, sir." Her voice had gone hard, flat, the voice of a woman who'd already buried one version of this exact lie once and wasn't going to bury another. "You know that better than anyone. You were there the last time somebody's convenient noise got somebody killed." Something in him broke quiet and total. "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment. 14 years of trust broken and half mended in the space of one conversation. It wasn't enough. It would have to be enough anyway, because there wasn't time left to wait for it to become something more solid. "I need Ruiz to get a jet fueled in the next 20 minutes, she said. "I need you to get Ashwell to hold that patrol at the gate as long as you possibly can. And I need you to tell me exactly where that transport is headed, because I only get one shot at intercepting it before it clears our airspace." Holt was already moving before she finished the sentence, pulling a folded map from a drawer he unlocked with hands that weren't quite steady, spreading it across the desk between them. "Here." He jabbed a finger at a stretch of empty desert 40 miles south, unmarked on the official chart, but scrawled over in pencil, with coordinates that looked like they'd been added by hand years ago and never erased. "Private strip. Built off the books sometime before you were even in flight school. It's been the endpoint every rotation for as long as I've known about any of this."
"Boss."
"How do you know all this and never once reported it?" "Because the first time I tried, the man I reported it to turned out to be part of it." His voice had gone rough, ragged at the edges. 3 years into my career, young and stupid enough to think the chain of command existed to protect people instead of itself. I filed a report with my squadron commander about irregular cargo weights. 2 weeks later, that report had vanished from the record entirely, and I found myself transferred to a assignment nobody requests voluntarily. Lesson learned, fast and permanent. Who was he, the commander? Dead now. Long since retired, then dead. Doesn't matter anymore. He shook his head like a man trying to physically dislodge the memory. After that, I told myself documentation was safer than confrontation. I was wrong about that too, Reese. I've been wrong about almost everything, apparently, except one thing. "What's that?" "You." He looked at her, something raw and unguarded in his face for the first time since she'd known him. "I was never wrong about you." Holt didn't hesitate this time. "East apron. Bearing 195, once airborne, low altitude to stay under radar coverage, heading for that strip 40 miles south." I was already moving toward the door. "Reese." She stopped. "I know I don't get to ask for anything from you. Not after everything. But be careful up there. I've already buried one Callahan I couldn't save. I don't intend to bury a second." She didn't answer that. There wasn't time for it to mean what it needed to mean. Not yet, maybe not for a long time after tonight either. She just nodded once and ran. Ruiz didn't ask questions this time. He just started moving the second he saw her face. "Same bird as before," he said, already unhooking tie-downs with hands that had clearly done this exact sequence in his sleep more than once since the last time she'd asked. "Fuel's topped. Ordnance is standard load. You want anything special mounted, you're out of luck on 90-second notice." "Standard's fine, Sergeant. Ashwell know about this. Ashwell's about to." Ruiz almost smiled. almost. "Ptsa," he said. "Man's finally starting to catch up to what everybody else already knew about you." He paused for half a second, wrench still in hand, something unusually serious crossing his face. "Whatever's out there tonight, Captain, come back from it. This base doesn't get to lose you twice." She climbed the ladder fast, dropped into the cockpit that had started somewhere over the last several days, to feel less like a memory and more like a place she actually belonged again. Her hands moved through pre-flight without hesitation now. No trembling, no 2 years of rust to shake off. Because muscle memory, once it woke back up, didn't go back to sleep easily. Radio traffic crackled to life the moment her engines caught. "Widow 1-1, this is Ashcombe Tower, be advised." "Belay that." A new voice. Ashwell's voice, tight, urgent, cutting through the channel like a man who'd finally completely run out of patience for protocol. "Captain Callahan is cleared hot. Repeat, cleared hot. Anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally after tonight." Something in Reese's chest loosened just slightly, just enough to breathe around. "Copy, Ashcombe. Widow 1-1 is airborne." 40 minutes earlier, on the Southern Perimeter Road, Weston Sutton sat in the passenger seat of a Humvee with his bad wrist braced against his chest and a rifle across his lap. He wasn't entirely sure he'd need tonight. "You good, Major?" His driver? A young sergeant named Ochoa glanced over, clearly picking up on something restless in Sutton's silence. "Fine." Sutton wasn't fine. Something about tonight's tasking order had felt wrong from the first briefing. A kind of specificity without substance coordinates and threat levels that read more like a script than an assessment. He'd flown enough missions to know the difference between real intelligence and something dressed up to look like it. "You don't sound fine, sir. No offense." "None taken." Sutton adjusted the brace on his wrist, a habit more than a necessity. At this point, something to occupy his good hand while the rest of him turned the briefing over one more time. "You ever get handed an order that reads exactly right on paper and still feels wrong in your gut?" "Every week, sir. Comes with the job." Sutton almost laughed. Almost. He'd volunteered anyway. Told himself it was about proving his wrist wasn't holding him back. Told himself it had nothing to do with 2 years of watching a woman he'd mocked turn out to be the best pilot on this base, and everything to do with wanting badly to feel useful again. The headlights swept across empty scrubland, mile after mile of nothing. The kind of nothing that made a man's instincts itch, even when he couldn't say exactly why. He had no idea riding in that Humvee toward a firefight built specifically to end his patrol loudly. How close he was about to come to finding out exactly how wrong his instincts had been to trust the tasking order at all. The Southern Perimeter Road stretched out below her like a scar across the desert headlights of the patrol vehicles crawling along it in a slow, unknowing line toward a firefight somebody else had already written the script for. She keyed her radio. "Any station this net, this is Widow 1-1. Be advised, intelligence tasking for tonight's Southern Sector patrol has been compromised. Repeat, compromised. Recommend immediate halt and recall." Static. Then a voice she recognized, immediately tight with confusion and the particular stubbornness of a man who didn't like being told to turn around mid-mission. "Widow 1-1, this is patrol lead. Who is this?" "This is Captain Reese Callahan, Major. Turn your patrol around. Now." A pause. A long one. "Callahan." Sutton's voice again, disbelieving in a way that would have been almost funny under any other circumstance. "The cook Callahan. The pilot Callahan, sir. Turn around." In the lead Humvee, Sutton pressed the radio hard against his ear, glancing at Ochoa beside him, who'd gone very still at the wheel, clearly listening just as intently. "She's not wrong about the tasking feeling off, sir," Ochoa said quietly, almost apologetically, like a man not sure he had permission to have an opinion. "I flagged it too. Figured it wasn't my place to say anything. Because there wasn't time to explain 14 years of buried conspiracy over an open channel, not with a transport already spooling engines 40 miles south and a patrol still rolling straight toward a fabricated firefight that had never needed to happen in the first place. Widow 1-1, I don't take orders from. You'll take this one." she snapped, or you'll explain to General Ashwell in the morning why you ignored a credible warning and got your whole patrol killed for somebody else's cover story. Silence. She watched the headlights on the ground below her slow, then stop. Say again your intel, Callahan. Tonight's threat report is fabricated, manufactured to draw every available unit on this base south, while a black market weapons shipment clears the East Apron north. You are not walking into a real engagement, Major. You're walking into a diversion designed to get people killed loudly enough that nobody looks at what's happening on the other side of this base. Another pause, shorter this time. Sutton sat with the radio silent in his hand for a moment, running the math the same way she had, feeling the shape of the trap close in retrospect around a mission he'd volunteered for that afternoon out of nothing more complicated than wounded pride. I thought about how close he'd come to walking his whole patrol into gunfire that existed purely to distract from something happening somewhere he'd never even have thought to look. Copy, Sutton said, finally something different in his voice now. Not disbelief anymore. Something closer to the particular respect that came from watching a plan you'd trusted collapse in real time and realizing all at once who'd actually been right. Patrol halting. Standing by for further. Reese banked north, because the patrol was safe now, which meant there was exactly one problem left between her and the truth finally fully coming into the light. A transport 40 miles south about to disappear into a private strip that wasn't on any chart the Air Force kept. She caught it 11 minutes later, a dark shape crawling low across the desert floor, running without lights, threading between two ridgelines, exactly the way something tried to avoid attention. Her radar warning receiver stayed quiet. No fighter escort, no countermeasures. Just a lumbering cargo transport that had never once expected an A-10 to find it out here, running, dark running, scared, running out of options, faster than its pilot had probably let himself imagine. She eased back on the throttle, dropping altitude in a long, patient arc, the way you approach something you didn't want to spook before you were close enough to control the outcome. Her father's voice again unbidden from somewhere further back than the garage. In Elko, from an even older memory of him talking about deer hunting when she was small enough to still need lifting onto his shoulders to see over the brush. Don't chase what you can outweight, Reese. Chasing just teaches it to run faster. Unidentified aircraft, this is United States Air Force Widow 11. You are in violation of restricted airspace. Identify yourself and reduce altitude for inspection. No response. She dropped altitude to match, closing the gap close enough now to make out the shape clearly. A civilian cargo transport, unmarked, exactly the profile Holt had described. Unidentified aircraft, this is your final warning. Reduce altitude and prepare for... The transport banked hard, sudden and violent, trying to break toward the ridgeline, where radar coverage would drop out completely. Except Reese had flown this exact terrain 100 times in training. Knew every fold in that ridge, every updraft. Every place a heavier, slower transport would struggle to maneuver where an A-10 wouldn't. She cut inside the turn, closing the angle, forcing the transport to choose between the ridge and her. Because that was the whole equation now. Not force. Geometry. The same cold, patient math that had gotten 3 men off Highway 9 alive, applied now to a machine trying to outrun a truth that had already caught up to it 14 years too late. It chose wrong. The transport clipped a rock formation on its left wingtip, just barely. Just enough to send it into a shuddering, uncontrolled wobble that any pilot watching would recognize immediately as the beginning of the end of a flight. Transport aircraft, you are damaged. Reduce speed and prepare for emergency landing. I say again, reduce speed. For a moment, nothing. Just the transport fighting to hold altitude, smoke starting to trail thin and gray from the damaged wing. Then finally, a voice crackled through on an open frequency, ragged with panic. We copy, damn it. Landing now. She watched it go down onto a flat stretch of desert floor, hard but controlled, skidding a long scar into the sand before finally shuddering to a stop. Reese circled once overhead, watching for movement, watching for anyone stupid enough to try running. Nobody ran. Whoever was inside that transport understood with total clarity exactly how outmatched they'd just become. By the time ground units reached the wreck, the story was already unraveling in every direction at once. Ruiz was among the first vehicles to arrive, having commandeered a maintenance truck. The second word of the crash reached the flight line, driving 40 miles of desert road, faster than any regulation would have technically allowed. He found her still sitting in the cockpit canopy up, staring at the wreckage a quarter-mile off, like a woman trying to convince herself it was real. "You good, Captain?" He climbed up the ladder without waiting for an answer, checking her over with the practiced eye of a man who'd seen plenty of pilots come down from an adrenaline spike wrong. "I'm good, Sergeant." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Better than good, actually. 14 years, and it's finally coming apart." "Then let's go watch it finish with Sam," he said, and something in his tone told her he meant it as more than just words. Crates in the cargo hold stenciled with false manifests that fooled nobody once security forces started prying them open. Military-grade components, the exact kind that had been quietly disappearing off this base for 14 years. Dressed up as agricultural equipment on paper that wouldn't survive 5 minutes of real scrutiny. And in the cockpit, alive, but badly shaken. 2 men who talked faster than any lawyer would have advised, desperate to trade information for leniency. The second they understood how thoroughly their operation had just collapsed, names came out of them in pieces. A network that stretched back further than 14 years, further than Reese had let herself imagine, reaching into procurement offices and logistics commands on bases most people had never heard of. Reese stood at the edge of the wreckage site, watching security forces zip-tie the transport's crew and load them into vehicles, feeling something she hadn't expected to feel yet. Not triumph, not relief. Something quieter and heavier, closer to grief, finally allowed to finish arriving after 14 years of being told there was nothing left to grieve properly. And one name repeated more than any other, belonging to a man who'd spent a decade and a half quietly running interference from inside Ashcombe's own command structure. Major Grady Voss. Reese sat in the cockpit long after landing, engine ticking as it cooled, absorbing that name. The way you absorbed a piece of shrapnel you hadn't noticed hitting you until the adrenaline wore off. Because Voss had been in the room the night the suited men threatened her. Voss had stood silently by the wall, watching, saying nothing, exactly the posture of a man who already knew how the conversation would end because he'd helped write it. She thought back to the operations room the morning this had all started. Voss's calm voice, calculating who's available, who's rated, who's not going to get somebody killed, and wondered with a cold twist in her stomach. How much of that calculation had been about protecting the mission, and how much had simply been about protecting himself? Holt had protected her out of 14 years of guilt. Voss had protected himself out of 14 years of profit. 2 men standing in the same shadow. Her father had died, trying to expose one of them, finally desperately trying to make it right. Security forces found Voss in his quarters an hour later. A bag half-packed on his bed, a set of documents burning in a metal trash can. He hadn't managed to finish before they arrived. I didn't resist. Didn't say much of anything, in fact, beyond a single sentence Reese heard about secondhand and turned over in her mind for days afterward. Tell her I'm sorry about her father. Tell her it was never supposed to go that far. It wasn't an apology that fixed anything. But it was at least confirmation of everything she'd spent 14 years suspecting and 2 weeks proving. And there was a strange, exhausted peace in finally hearing it said out loud by someone who'd actually been there. The hearing, when it finally happened 3 weeks later, wasn't the court-martial anyone had originally expected. Reese stood in dress uniform in a room considerably more crowded than the one she'd been dragged into by security forces that night, facing a board that had spent 3 weeks combing through evidence that started with a torque wrench and ended with an arrest warrant naming officers on 2 other installations. She'd spent those 3 weeks in a strange, suspended kind of waiting. Reinstated to flight status pending the board's findings technically, but grounded in practice, while investigators pieced together 14 years of falsified records, and every day that passed felt like standing on a runway. Watching weather roll in, unable to tell yet whether it would clear or close in for good. She'd spent part of those weeks visiting the archive room, where Petrov worked, watching investigators from 2 other installations. Photograph documents he'd spent months quietly gathering, and she found a strange, quiet satisfaction in seeing his careful, unglamorous work finally treated with the weight it deserved. He'd been offered a formal commendation for his role in the investigation. He'd turned it down twice before finally accepting embarrassed. He admitted by the idea that digitizing old paperwork counted as heroism. "It's not the paperwork that was heroic, Petrov," she'd told him. "It's what you did with what the paperwork told you." General Ashwell spoke first. Read a summary of events so carefully worded it somehow managed to be both completely accurate and completely inadequate to describe what she'd actually done. Sentences full of phrases like irregularities were identified and subsequent action was taken. Bureaucratic language doing its best to flatten 2 weeks that had nearly gotten her killed twice into something a board could process in an afternoon. Reese sat through it without flinching, hands folded in her lap. The same discipline that had carried her through 100 pre-flight checks, now carrying her through this instead. Then Weston Sutton stood. Nobody had asked him to. A murmur moved through the room. Board members exchanging glances, unsure what a major with no formal role in these proceedings intended to add. Sutton didn't wait for permission to become certainty. He simply stood, squared his shoulders, despite the brace still visible beneath his sleeve, and waited for the room to settle. "Sir, permission to speak." His voice steady, carrying easily through a room that had gone very quiet. "I want the record to reflect something that isn't going to show up in any of these reports." "Maz?" The board president nodded. 2 years ago, and for most of the 2 years since, I thought Captain Callahan was exactly what half this base decided she was. A washout. A cautionary tale. I laughed along with jokes I should have shut down the first time I heard them. He didn't look at Reese while he said it. Looked instead at the board, like a man determined to say the hardest part without flinching. 3 weeks ago, that same woman personally saved my patrol from walking into a fabricated firefight designed to get every one of us killed for somebody else's cover story. She did it without hesitation, without being asked. And she did it after 2 years of this base treating her like she didn't matter. His voice caught just slightly before he pushed through it. "I owe her an apology. I don't think this room is the right place to give properly. But I intend to give it anyway. Because if there's one thing I've learned watching Captain Callahan fly, it's that some debts don't get smaller, just because you're embarrassed to pay them." Near the back of the room, Sergeant Ochoa sat quietly among the other witnesses called to corroborate the patrol's account, watching his majors say in public what he'd only half admitted in the front seat of a Humvee 3 weeks earlier. He found himself nodding along without meaning to a small private confirmation that the instinct he'd voiced that night. The tasking order feeling wrong had turned out to matter more than either of them had understood at the time. He turned, found her eyes across the room. "I'm sorry, Captain, for every joke, for every assumption, for every day I let this base underestimate you, instead of standing up and saying what should have been obvious from the start. A breath. You're the finest pilot I've ever flown alongside. It shouldn't have taken almost losing my life to make me say that out loud." The room was silent for a long moment. Reese didn't trust her voice enough to answer right away. When she finally did, it came out quieter than she meant it to, but steadier too. "Apology accepted, Major." A pause. "Try not to need almost dying to figure things out next time." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, tension breaking just slightly, just enough to let everyone breathe. They cleared her of every charge within the hour. Insubordination, theft of government property, unauthorized combat action. All of it dissolved under the weight of what she'd actually stopped. All of it recontextualized from crime into the only thing that had ever made sense. A pilot doing exactly what her training and her conscience demanded, regardless of what a broken system had told her she wasn't allowed to do. The board president read the findings aloud, and Reese stood perfectly still through all of it. The same discipline that had carried her through 100 pre-flight checks, now holding her upright. Through a moment 2 years of doubt had convinced her might never actually arrive. When he finished, there was a beat of silence and then, unexpectedly, applause. Not the polite kind, but something rawer, several officers rising to their feet without being asked. Ruiz whistling sharp and loud from the back of the room until someone elbowed him into a more dignified silence. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself somewhere over Highway 9 3 weeks ago that she wouldn't, not in a room full of people who'd need to see her steady more than they needed to see her relieved. But something in her chest finally fully unclenched, 2 years of held breath releasing all at once. And she understood standing there, that this was what her father had meant all those years ago in that garage. Calm wasn't the absence of everything you'd been carrying. It was what you did with it once you were finally safely allowed to set it down. Holt testified 2 days later in a closed session. Reese wasn't present for providing enough detail about 14 years of quiet complicity to bring down not just Voss, but 3 other names attached to bases scattered across 2 states. He held nothing back, she was told. Afterward, dates, names, transfer records, the entire architecture of a silence he'd maintained for a decade and a half, laid out in full for investigators who hadn't expected a man his age to simply hand over everything without a fight. She heard later that he'd resigned his commission the same afternoon, before anyone had the chance to force the decision for him. Chose accountability over the small mercy of being pushed. Word moved through the base quickly the way it always did. Some people called it cowardice, resigning before the board could formally act. Reese didn't see it that way. She'd watched him make one decision after another for 14 years, designed to control the outcome, to manage the damage on his own terms rather than someone else's. Resigning first was in its own way, the last version of that instinct, except this time for once, he wasn't managing it to protect himself. He was managing it to spare the Air Force the mess of having to decide what to do with a man who'd finally told the truth. She found him one last time by the equipment shed, sitting where he always sat, looking smaller somehow in civilian clothes than he ever had in uniform. A cardboard box sat beside him. Half-packed, the small accumulated evidence of 30 years, reduced to something that fit in his own 2 hands. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said before she could speak. "I don't think I've earned it. I just wanted to say it plainly once, without a shed full of secrets standing between us. 14 years is a long time to carry something alone, sir. It was the wrong choice from the very first day I made it." He looked out at the flight line the same way he always had, like it might finally answer a question he'd stopped asking. "Your father would be proud of you, Reese. Not because of what happened these last few weeks. Because of who you were before any of it. That part was never in question." "What will you do now?" He considered the question longer than she expected, like a man genuinely unsure of the answer, for the first time in longer than he could remember. "I don't know yet," he admitted. 30 years, I always knew exactly what came next. Following orders, giving them, protecting a secret I convinced myself was protecting you. I suppose I'll have to learn how to just be a person again. Might take a while." "You could start by not disappearing," she said quietly, surprising herself with how much she meant it. "This base is smaller without you standing in it. Even now, even knowing everything." "You mean that?" "I wouldn't have said it otherwise, sir. I'm not in the habit of saying things I don't mean. Comes from spending 2 years listening to people who did." Something in his face shifted, gratitude and grief tangled together, in a way that made him look for just a moment exactly as old and exactly as young as the 14 years between her father's death and this conversation deserved. "For what it's worth," he added, quieter now, "I intend to write everything down, all of it, properly this time, not buried in a drawer where it can vanish the way my first report did. Whatever happens to me after that, at least the record will finally exist somewhere nobody can quietly erase it again. I'd like to read it, sir, when you're done. I'll make sure you're the first." She didn't have an answer that felt big enough for that. So she just sat with him a while, in the same silence they'd shared 100 times before, letting it mean whatever it needed to mean between 2 people who'd both loved the same man and both in their own broken ways tried to honor what he left behind. Boyd Trammell found her, the morning of the ceremony, hovering awkwardly near the mess hall doors, like a man who'd rehearsed something and lost most of it the moment he actually had to say it. He'd clearly been standing there a while, working up the nerve, and it showed in the way he kept shifting his weight from one foot to the other, like the ground itself might change its mind about holding him up. "Callahan." He shifted his weight hands, jammed in his pockets, none of the swagger she'd spent 2 years learning to ignore anywhere in his posture now. "Got a minute? For you, Trammell, always dangerous, but sure." He almost smiled at that, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. "Fair. I probably earned that." "You did? Look." He exhaled long and awkward. "I was a jackass. For 2 years. I made jokes about you burning bacon while you were sitting on the kind of story that turns out to be the realest thing that's happened on this base in a decade. I don't have some big speech like Sutton gave. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Genuinely. And that if you ever need someone to carry something heavy, or watch your six on the ground, I'd consider it an honor, not a joke. Reese studied him a moment, weighing 2 years of small cruelties against one clumsy, honest apology, delivered by a man who clearly found sincerity harder than sarcasm. Apology accepted. Trammell. A small pause, the corner of her mouth lifting despite herself. Try the PT test again next month. I hear the standards are the same for everybody, even legends. He laughed short and surprised the sound of a man relieved to have survived a conversation he'd been dreading all week. The ceremony was small. Ashwell's request, not hers, a quiet gathering on the flight line rather than the formal auditorium. The base commander had originally proposed because some things he said deserved the same sky they'd been earned under. The late afternoon sun hung low and gold over Ashcombe, throwing long shadows across the tarmac, where the whole base seemed to have gathered without anyone formally calling assembly. Reese stood at attention while Ashwell read the citation words about valor and initiative and extraordinary service that felt for the first time in 2 years. Like they were actually describing her, instead of the version of her everyone had decided to believe in instead. She let herself listen, really listen to phrases she might have dismissed as empty 2 years ago. Exceptional airmanship under hostile fire. Unwavering commitment to the safety of others, regardless of personal risk. Sentences would have felt like they belonged to somebody else. Some idealized pilot, who existed only in recruiting posters, now settling onto her shoulders like something that actually fit. Then he opened a small case, and inside it sat a set of ribbons she recognized instantly, because she'd spent her entire childhood staring at an identical set pinned to her father's chest. Your father earned these twice over and never got to wear a third, Ashwell said quietly, pinning them to her uniform with hands steadier than she expected from a man who'd spent 2 years failing her before he finally didn't. Consider this partly his. He'd have wanted it that way. Her throat tightened around words she didn't try to say out loud. Some moments didn't need narration. They just needed to be stood inside of fully, without flinching away from how much they cost to earn. She thought briefly of the phone call she'd made 2 nights earlier, the first real conversation she'd had with her mother in longer than either of them liked to admit. She hadn't told her everything. Some of it would take years to explain properly, if it ever could be fully explained at all. But she'd told her enough. Enough for her mother to go quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment and then say in a voice thick with something between grief and vindication, your father always said someone would finally listen. I just didn't think it would take this long. Reese hadn't had an answer for that either. Some debts apparently simply took as long as they took. She looked down the flight line at the assembled crew. Ruiz, arms crossed, doing a poor job hiding how proud he looked. Petrov practically vibrating with the particular joy of a man who'd risked his career and had it pay off exactly the way he'd hoped. Dell near the back, grinning so wide it looked like it hurt already, composing in his head the version of this story he'd tell in the mess hall for years to come. Even Trammell standing quiet near the edge of the formation, present in a way that felt less like obligation and more like something close to respect, finally belatedly earned. And Sutton standing near the front, offering the smallest nod she'd ever seen, carry that much weight. Reese Callahan looked up at the sky she'd spent 2 years watching from behind a mess hall window, aching for something she'd convinced herself she'd never get back. She had it back now. All of it. And more than that, she had the truth her father had died trying to protect, finally standing in daylight where it belonged. Because fear wasn't the problem. Her father had told her that, in a garage, 15 years ago, cleaning a rifle scope, teaching her, without either of them realizing it was a lesson that would take her this long to fully understand. Fear was just information. The problem was letting it drive. She hadn't. Not when it mattered. Not when a highway full of strangers needed the sky to open up and save them. And not when the truth about her own father's death demanded she risk everything a second time to finally drag it into the light. Reese Callahan climbed the ladder to her aircraft one more time that afternoon, alone. No mission waiting, no emergency pulling her into the sky. Just herself and the machine that had once been taken from her, and a horizon that finally, after everything, belonged to her again. She lifted off into a sky gone gold with late afternoon light. Banking slow and easy over Ashcombe, over the mess hall, where she'd once diced onions, with hands that remembered exactly how to fly over the equipment shed, where 14 years of silence had finally broken over a flight line full of people who'd learned all at once, and far too late, exactly who'd been standing among them the entire time. Below her, the whole base looked smaller than it ever had, from the ground, its long shadows stretching gold and quiet across the desert, holding inside its fence line every version of the story that had brought her here, the grief, the silence, the slow accumulation of small injustices, and finally, at the end of it, the truth breaking through like weather clearing after a storm that had lasted far too long. And somewhere far below, watching her go, Weston Sutton allowed himself for the first time in longer than he could remember to simply feel grateful. Because the woman he'd once mocked as nothing more than a cook had turned out to be the only person on this entire base, brave enough to fly straight into the fire and bring everyone else home. High above Ashcombe, alone in a cockpit that finally fully belonged to her, again Reese Callahan looked out at a horizon burning gold at the edges and let herself, for the first time in 14 years, simply breathe. No mission, no countdown, no file cabinet full of half-buried lies waiting to be dragged into daylight. Just the sky wide and quiet and entirely her own, exactly the way her father had always promised it could be.